"How dare you slap our son?" my mother-in-law shouted. "He was misbehaving," I clarified. "But they threw me out of the house." Months later, what unfolded leaves everyone shocked. The house was always loud, filled with voices overlapping, laughter echoing off the walls, and the constant clatter of dishes. It was the kind of place where everyone had an opinion, and no one really listened. The walls were plastered with family photos, smiling faces frozen in time, but I felt like I was standing in a frame that didn't include me. I had always tried to fit in, to be the daughter-in-law who made everything easier. I cooked, I cleaned, I smiled even when it hurt. But this time was different. I remember the day I decided to tell them. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking, but I thought, they're family. They'll understand. We gathered in the living room, Mark, his parents, and me. The sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. I sat stiffly on the edge of the couch, my fingers clutching my purse like it was a life raft. Mark's brother. He's been inappropriate with me," I blurted out, the words rushing out like they'd been trapped for too long. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Mark's mother, Sarah, blinked at me, her expression shifting from casual concern to disbelief. "Are you sure?" she asked. Her tone sharp, like I'd just accused someone of stealing a car. I nodded, my throat tightening. "Yes. I don't feel safe around him." Mark's father, John, scoffed, his chair creaking as he shifted his weight. "Come on, Bethy. You're probably just overreacting. He's family." Mark just stared at me, his eyes filled with confusion and disbelief. The man I'd trusted most in the world was looking at me like I was the villain in a story I hadn't written. My chest tightened, frustration bubbling up like a kettle on the edge of boiling over. Then it happened. Jake walked in, his usual smug grin plastered across his face, as if he hadn't just been the source of my heartbreak. He had that arrogant look, the one that made you wonder how someone could be so sure of themselves without a single ounce of self-awareness. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I stood up and slapped him. The sound echoed through the room, sharp and final. He blinked, stunned, his hand instinctively rising to his cheek. The room went silent again, but this time, the silence was different. It was filled with unspoken words, with eyes that refused to meet mine. But then, something shifted. Mark's voice broke the silence, sharp and cutting. "Bethy, what the hell are you doing?" I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "I'm doing what you all should have done, standing up to him." But instead of support, instead of questions, I was met with accusations. "Maybe you're the one causing trouble," Sarah snapped, her eyes narrowing. "Yeah," John added, crossing his arms over his chest. "You're making this up to cover your own mistakes." Mark looked at me like I was a stranger. "I can't believe you'd do this, Bethy. You're making a scene for no reason." I felt like the walls were closing in, their words drowning me, suffocating me. "No one's making a scene," I whispered, my voice trembling with fury and hurt. "The scene was made the day he crossed the line. I'm just the only one brave enough to admit it." But they didn't want to hear that. They wanted me to leave. "Maybe you should go," Sarah said coldly, her voice leaving no room for argument. Mark didn't say anything, just stared at me, his silence louder than any words. I grabbed my bag, my hands shaking, tears blurring my vision. I didn't look back as I slammed the door behind me. The house that I thought was home had become a prison, filled with people who'd rather protect their own than face the ugly truth. I walked down the street, the cold air biting at my skin, but I felt nothing. I walked down the street, the cold air biting at my skin, but I felt nothing. I wasn't angry. I was numb, because the hardest part wasn't the betrayal, it was realizing that the people I thought loved me didn't even believe me, and that was the moment I knew I was better off without them. The streets blurred as I walked, the cold air slicing through my thin jacket, but it wasn't the chill that made my bones ache. It was the emptiness, the silence that followed me after I left. I didn't have a plan. No destination, no comfort waiting for me on the other side. Just an overwhelming need to get away, to escape the house that had once been my home, the people who'd once been my family. I ended up at my parents' house, the place where I'd grown up, where the walls carried echoes of my childhood laughter. It was strange, stepping back into that familiar space, now feeling like a stranger in my own life. When I rang the doorbell, my mother opened it, her face filled with surprise and concern. The moment she saw me, her expression softened, and she pulled me into a tight embrace. "Oh, Bethy," she whispered, her hands trembling slightly as she held me. "What happened?" I couldn't find the words. I just broke down, tears spilling over as I clung to her like a child again. My father joined us, his usual stoic expression replaced with a quiet, unreadable gaze. He didn't say much, just wrapped his arm around me, grounding me with his presence. They didn't ask questions. They didn't push for details. They just held me, offering the comfort I'd been craving without words. Over the next few weeks, I stayed with them. The house felt warm, not because it was perfect, but because it was filled with unconditional love. My parents didn't judge me. They didn't tell me to move on. They just let me be. My friends reached out too. Emma, Lisa, even Jenna from college. I hadn't talked to her in years, but she called as soon as she heard. "Bethy, you're not alone in this," she said. Her voice steady and fierce. They came over, bringing ice cream, old movies, and memories of simpler times. We laughed, cried, and talked about everything and nothing. It was like peeling away layers of grief to find the Bethy I thought I'd lost. My family and friends reminded me that I was more than just the pain I'd endured. I was someone worthy of love and respect, even if the people I thought I could trust hadn't seen it. Then, one ordinary afternoon, as I was sorting through some old boxes, my phone buzzed. New message, from Mark. I stared at it, my heart skipping a beat. The message read, "Bethy, I've sent the divorce papers. I hope you find happiness." It hit me like a wave. Not because I was surprised, I'd been expecting it, in some way, but because it felt so final. I stared at the papers when they arrived, the crisp sound of the envelope tearing open echoing in the quiet room. But as I looked at them, I realized something. I didn't feel broken. I felt free. It wasn't the end. It was a beginning. The divorce papers arrived on a cold Tuesday morning, crisp and formal, like a final sentence written in ink. I stared at them for a long time, the words blurring as my vision filled with unshed tears. It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was the weight of years spent in a marriage that had slowly chipped away at who I was. The laughter that once filled the walls of our home now felt like echoes from another lifetime. The days that followed were a blur. There were lawyers, phone calls, and arguments over things I didn't care about anymore. Who gets what, whose name stays on the lease, the fine print of a love that had long since faded. Mark didn't fight for me. He didn't even seem to care. The courtroom was sterile, the judge's voice robotic as he read out the decree. I sat there, numb, wondering if this was the part where I'd feel relief. But all I felt was emptiness, like I'd lost something I wasn't even sure I had. I didn't cry in court. I didn't cry when I signed the papers. I cried the night I got home, alone in the dim light of my apartment. But life had a way of pushing you forward, even when you weren't ready. I threw myself into work, trying to fill the void with busyness. But the emptiness lingered, a ghost that refused to be ignored. That's when I met him. It was a rainy afternoon. I was at a local cafe, the kind with mismatched furniture and the comforting aroma of coffee and old books. I'd gone there to escape the weight of the divorce, to drown my thoughts in caffeine and noise. But then he walked in. Ethan. He wasn't extraordinary in the way movie heroes are. No chiseled jawline. No dramatic entrance. Just a man with kind eyes, a crooked smile, and an air of quiet confidence that made you feel like you mattered without even trying. He ordered coffee and sat by the window, pulling out a worn notebook. Something about him pulled me in. Maybe it was the way he absent-mindedly tapped his pen against the notebook, lost in thought, or the way he looked up and met my gaze with a smile that said, "I see you." I didn't expect to talk to him. But life has a way of making connections when you least expect it. We started with small talk, about the weather, the cafe's playlist, the weird way the barista made lattes. But then it shifted. "I like your necklace," he said, nodding toward the silver charm I wore. "It's a gift from my mother," I replied, feeling a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. We talked for hours. He listened. Really listened. Not like the people I'd left behind, not like Mark who'd dismissed my pain. Ethan listened like my words mattered. As the rain stopped and the sky turned a shade of soft gold, he said, "You know, you're not as lost as you think." I smiled, the first real smile I'd had in weeks. "Thanks," I whispered, but it wasn't just a thank you, it was the start of something new, something that didn't carry the weight of my past. It was a quiet evening when the message came through, Mark's name flashing on my phone like a shadow from the past I thought I'd buried. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let it fade like the echoes of a bad dream. But curiosity tugged at me, that nagging voice asking, "What does he want?" I answered, "Bethy." His voice was hesitant, laced with guilt and something else, desperation. I leaned back in my chair, arms crossed, my heart guarded. "Mark," I replied coolly, my voice steady but distant. I'm sorry," he blurted out, his words tumbling over each other like he couldn't get them out fast enough. "I was wrong. I should have believed you. I was a fool." I stared at the wall, his words a dull ache in the back of my mind. "You don't get to do this," I said finally, my voice sharp. "You didn't believe me when I needed you the most. Now you think an apology makes it okay?" There was a long silence, then he sighed, defeated. "I know. I didn't realize how blind I was. Jake, he's in jail now. For misconduct at work. The company fired him. Mark's voice faltered. "He's been arrested, Bethy." I sat in stunned silence, the words washing over me like cold water. So, the man I'd tried to protect, the one who'd made me feel small, was finally facing consequences, but it didn't feel satisfying. It just felt empty. Mark continued, his voice trembling with regret. "The family. They're ashamed. They've lost respect, Bethy. They're looking at me like I failed as a brother, as a son-in-law." I felt a bitter laugh bubbling up, but I swallowed it down. "You lost respect when you chose him over me," I said quietly, my heart pounding. "You lost it when you didn't stand up for the person who stood by you." There was another pause. "I miss you," Mark whispered. I closed my eyes, the pain of the past threatening to resurface. "I don't miss you," I replied, my voice steady. "I don't miss the lies, the betrayal, the silence when I needed someone to hear me." He didn't respond. I ended the call, staring at the screen, feeling nothing but the faint echo of a heart that had already moved on. But that wasn't the end. The next day, I got a message from Sarah, Mark's mother. "Bethy, we're sorry. We were wrong. Please come back. We need you." I stared at the message, a bitter taste in my mouth. I didn't reply, because I realized something. I didn't need their apology. I didn't need them to validate my pain. I was whole without them, and I had someone now who listened, who cared. Not because he was obligated, but because he genuinely wanted to. Ethan. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace. It started subtly. An unmarked envelope slipped under my door, a message left on my voicemail with a familiar, pleading voice. "Bethy, it's Sarah. Please, we need to talk. You're the only one who can help us." At first, I ignored it, thinking it was just another attempt to patch things up after the damage had been done. But then came the text messages, dozens of them, filled with apologies, regrets, and desperate pleas. "We're not the same without you. Mark's falling apart. Please, just come back. For the sake of the family." I didn't respond, but the messages didn't stop. A week later, I found them outside my apartment. Sarah and John, standing on the street, their faces etched with guilt, their eyes desperate. They didn't even try to hide it. They stood there, waiting, like they thought I'd suddenly forget everything and walk back into the life I'd left behind. I didn't. Instead, I ignored them, walking past without a glance. But it didn't end there. They started showing up at my work, standing outside, peering through the windows, their expressions a mix of hope and desperation. Then came the phone calls, late at night, their voices trembling, trying to convince me that I was the missing piece in their broken family. "Bethy, please. We need you. You're the only one who can save us." I blocked their numbers, but they found new ones. They sent emails, messages on social media, even letters to my friends, trying to turn them against me. they painted me as the villain, the one who'd walked away from a family that loved her. But their words couldn't drown out the truth. I wasn't the villain, I was the survivor. One evening, I found a note on my car windshield: "We're sorry. We miss you. Please come back." I stared at it, my heart a mix of anger and sadness. Then I realized something: they weren't reaching out because they cared, they were reaching out because they needed me to save their faces. They wanted to fix the image they'd broken, not the relationship they'd ruined. So, I made a decision. I didn't respond. I didn't fight back, I just lived my life, with Ethan by my side, with my friends and family who truly cared. I found peace, because the only thing I needed to save was myself, and I was doing just fine. The days grew longer. Filled with light, both literal and metaphorical, Ethan and I had built something simple but profound. Our connection wasn't about filling a void, it was about creating space for something new. We didn't rush. We didn't force anything. We just existed together. I found myself laughing more, the sound no longer foreign to me. I painted with a freedom I hadn't known before, each stroke a release, each color a declaration of my rebirth. But the shadows of the past lingered. One morning, I woke up to an unexpected message: "Bethy, it's Mark. I need to talk to you. Please." I stared at the screen, my heart skipping, not out of hope. Not out of longing. Just curiosity. I didn't respond right away. But later that day, I found myself standing outside a small cafe, my phone in my hand, debating whether to block him entirely. Instead, I replied, "Why?" He responded almost instantly, I need closure. I've been thinking about everything, and I realize now that I was wrong. I'm sorry. I thought about it. I thought about the years of silence, the betrayal, the hurt, and then I thought about how far I'd come, so I agreed to meet him. It wasn't for reconciliation. It wasn't to rekindle anything, it was for closure. We met at a quiet park, the autumn leaves falling like fragments of the past. Mark looked different, tired, worn, his eyes clouded with regret. He started. But I held up my hand. "Mark," I said firmly, "I don't need an apology. I've already moved on." He swallowed hard, his pride battling with the weight of his mistakes. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for how I treated you." I nodded slowly, feeling no anger, no resentment. "Just peace." "Good," I replied softly. "Because I don't carry that baggage anymore." And with that, I walked away, leaving the past exactly where it belonged. Weeks later, I stood on a rooftop with Ethan. The city skyline stretched out before us, bathed in the golden hues of dusk. "I never thought I'd find this kind of peace," I whispered. Leaning against the railing, Ethan wrapped his arm around me, his warmth grounding me. "You didn't find peace, Bethy," he said gently. "You created it." And he was right, because life isn't about waiting for the storm to pass. It's about learning how to dance in the rain, and sometimes, it's about finding someone who'll dance with you. Feeling its warmth seep into my skin, and I smiled. Because sometimes, the best gifts aren't the ones you buy, they're the ones you give with your heart.